In this video, I want to show you how to add and configure shadows on SwiftUI views. After watching this video, you'll be able to apply both hard and soft shadows on any SwiftUI view and also be able to apply shadows to specific edges of a view. Since adding shadows in SwiftUI is similar to CSS, we are going to use this demo as our example. To add a shadow to any SwiftUI view, you need three and only three components. You should specify the color of the shadow, the blur radius of the shadow, and the shadow offset. So for the shadow offset, we have two parameters. The vertical offset, that is used to position the shadow either on the bottom part of the view or at the top part of the view. We also have the horizontal offset, whether you want to position the shadow on the leading edge or the trailing edge of the view. So for the SwiftUI example, we only need these parameters: the horizontal offset, vertical offset, the shadow radius, and color. In the Xcode project, I have added these images just for demonstration purpose. So to add your shadow, you need to use the shadow modifier. At the moment, none of the images in the preview has a shadow. So to add a shadow to any view, you need to use the shadow modifier. In the parentheses, you specify the color, the radius of the shadow, which is the amount of blur you want to apply to the shadow. If you leave this option as 0, you get a solid shadow. And as you increase the amount to a larger value, you get a very soft shadow. The next parameter is the horizontal offset. Then we have the Y offset for positioning the shadow either on the top edge or the bottom edge. So if you specify each of the parameters as 0, you have noticed here we don't have any shadow. So let's go to the second example. For the second image, we can request that we want a radius of 5. So let's change this value to 5. I will then enlarge the preview. Once you specify the value of the radius without specifying any value for the X or Y offset, you apply the shadow to all the edges of the view. So you have noticed from the second image, the shadow is applied to all the 4 edges of the view. Let's go to the third example. For this example, we want to apply the shadow to all the 4 edges of the view with a larger blur amount. For the second example, we set the blur radius to 5. So over here, let's change it to, for example, 10. The images touch the edges of the phone. So let's add padding. I'm going to select the V-stack containing all the views and add a padding here. So for the third example, we have the radius as 10. You don't see it well. Since the blur amount is much larger, you have noticed it is not visible as the second example, as the shadow on the second image. And also, we don't see it because we haven't specified both the vertical and the horizontal offsets. In the next example, we want to set the vertical and the horizontal offsets. So I'll jump to the fourth example. Over here, we want to have a solid shadow without any blur. We want to position the shadow at the bottom edge and the right edge of the view. So for the radius, we will leave it as 0. Then we specify the X offset as 5 and the Y offset as 5 as well. You have now noticed for the fourth image, we have the shadow at both right and the bottom edges. So in this example, we have a solid shadow without any blur. In the next example, we will keep the values the same for the vertical and the horizontal offsets and also apply a radius of 5. So you have noticed here for the fifth image, we have the same amount of vertical and horizontal offsets with a much softer shadow because of the blur radius of 5. For the sixth image, we want to position the shadow on the right and the bottom part with a much larger blur. So we will set the radius as 10. Then we keep both X and the Y values as 5. Again, since we have a larger radius, you don't see the shadow as the shadow on the fifth image. Let's move on to the seventh image. For this one, we want to have a large bottom and right offset without any blur. So we leave the radius as 0. Then we change the X amount to 10 and the Y as 10 as well. As you have noticed, we now have a larger solid shadow at the bottom and the right edges of the view. Next, we will make the shadow remain at the same position. However, we want to have a small blur. So we set the radius to 5. Then we leave the X and Y offsets the same as the previous example. We still have a larger shadow, but it is much softer. In the last example, we will keep the radius as 10, the X offset as 10, and the Y offset as 10. And that becomes even much softer. By specifying the X and Y offsets, we position the shadow at the bottom part and the right part of the view. In some situations, you may want to move the position. For example, you want to position the shadow on the leading and the top edges of the view. So in that case, you can specify these as negative values. Let's go to the one that has a solid shadow. For example, this one. That is the 7th image. So let's put a negative sign here for the X offset. You have seen we now have the shadow at the leading edge. We can also put a negative value here so that it will move to the top. So we now have it at the leading and the top edges of the view. So this is all about adding and positioning shadows to specific edges of SwiftUI views. I showed you how to apply both hard and soft shadows.